The collapse of the United States. It's a surprisingly popular topic these days, and when you look around society, you begin to see why. Subreddits like r collapse have close to 400k members, prepping YouTubers have gathered massive audiences, and countless prominent figures have hinted at a potentially unstable future for the West. In today's video, we examine this taboo topic from an unbiased lens, looking at the situation from a different angle. It's a video that was largely inspired by a post from the FATFIRE subreddit labeled Protecting Against the Tail Risk of US Political Instability. FATFIRE, after all, is a forum dedicated to multi-millionaires, and this wild question received over 350 serious answers. It makes you wonder, is this something we honestly have to worry about? To answer this bizarre question, we first have to establish a foundation. If you listen to people like Warren Buffett, their general view of the West is extremely positive. He's been quoted countless times saying that the US always finds a way to dig itself out of sticky situations and come out victorious. We will get into this more positive attitude later, but essentially we have two sides to this collapse story. We have the never bet against America crowd, or Team Warren, who believes this country perseveres and adapts to any situation no matter how difficult or evil. Then on the other side, we have the Doomsdayers, a group that varies wildly in their opinion, but ultimately they all share the belief that the American empire has already peaked and we, the West, are headed towards a sudden decline which will lead to political instability, potentially even civil war. Many people will hear this and dismiss this group as insane, but you'd be surprised how many prominent, smart individuals have this pessimistic view. Warren Buffett's right-hand man, Charlie Munger, has said it himself. Back in 2005, he shouted a shocking quote while sitting right next to Warren at the annual shareholder meeting in Omaha, Nebraska. Take a listen.
Well, I agree with you that the economics of the country are probably going to increase for a considerable period ahead. But I suspect that in very important ways we are at or near the apex of a great civilization.
You heard it here first, folks.
And Munger isn't the only one. Today, countless billionaires have hinted at the sad reality of the future. For example, Ray Dalio recently wrote a book titled The Changing World Order, where he goes over the factors that play into the collapse of empires throughout history. He even directly states that the US, according to his opinion, has a 30% chance of experiencing a civil war of sorts within the next 10 years. Now, this guy isn't just some random author off the street. He's a famous billionaire hedge fund manager who has never made claims like that in the past. It's a truly shocking direct statement given his sensitive public reputation. By the way, this isn't some off-the-cuff remark. It's a well-researched position that Dalio spent years looking into. You can hear him talk about it in this recent interview clip. But before we go into his shocking comment, a quick word from our sponsor, Masterworks.io. I want to tell you a story, one that showcases the power of alternative assets even during the most turbulent times. It's 1984, and a couple stumbles on a gallery in the Lower East Side of New York City. They check out the art and decide to buy a painting by a little-known New York City street artist for $20,000. Fast forward to 2017, the family decides to sell the painting at auction. The result? The canvas sold for over $110 million, making its creator, Jean-Michel Basquiat, the most expensive American artist at auction ever. Had the couple not decided to buy the piece and put that money in the S&P 500 instead, they would have made $271,000. There have been some astronomical price gains in the art world, and it's no surprise it's been touted as the hottest market on earth by the Wall Street Journal. Now anyone can buy shares of Basquiat and access the world of blue chip art. Today's sponsor, Masterworks, is democratizing this once exclusive asset class where prices have outperformed S&P returns by 174% between 1995 and 2020. They buy incredible pieces of art ranging from $1 million to $30 million by artists like Banksy and Picasso. They then securitize them with the SEC, allowing investors to buy shares on their site in an initial offering similar to an IPO. Once you've bought part of your favorite piece, you can then hold on to it until the piece is sold, at which point you can cash out, or you can sell your shares on the secondary market to someone else. Masterworks just sold their second painting, a George Condo, returning a 31.7% IRR to investors. So if that sounds interesting to you, and if diversifying your investment portfolio is important to you, then make sure you check out Masterworks.io. There's a link down below in the description for you to check out. Now let's get back to the video and Dalio's absurd comment.
You write that the U.S. has a 30% chance of devolving into a civil war within the next 10 years. what would cause that to happen, and who would be responsible for that?
Well, let me clarify what I mean. What I mean is that fighting over the rules, it doesn't mean necessarily shooting each other, although you could see much more violence. It means that the rules of the system, that democracy by rule of law, and the deferring to what the rules are, for example, to settle elections or settle issues, I think that could be largely lost. I think, for example, like they had sanctuary cities, you could see situations in which the federal government would give mandates that would not be followed by the state governments. And then there's a question of how you just have power and who has what power. And I think that you're going to see a lot more tested through the legal system and then maybe even beyond.
So while he does backtrack a bit there in the follow-up, there's no denying there are plenty of people who believe that the collapse of the West is imminent. A falling empire isn't exactly a new spectacle. It's happened over and over again throughout history under different circumstances and timelines. However, one common theme emerges when you study most of these falls: complete destruction of the currency, achieved by massive money printing and debasement. Even in the Roman Empire, this fall can be traced. During the start, a Roman coin contained over 96% silver. When the empire declined, so did the silver content. To pay for debts and government spending, the emperor slowly removed more and more silver from each coin. By 268, there was so little silver, each coin was practically a piece of aluminum foil. In fact, most reserve currencies on Earth only last about 94 years on average, and when the currency is fiat or backed by nothing, that number is even less. The US dollar has been the global reserve for about 100 years, and these elements, along with countless others including a frustrated population, political instability, and a growing wealth gap, have many people convinced that the end is near. But there is another side to this story, one that is rooted in a reality that most Americans choose to ignore. And it's also one that doesn't get as many views as those market collapse videos. Warren Buffett is often quoted saying never bet against America, and there's an official term for this. It's called American exceptionalism. The idea that the United States is inherently different from other nations. Its proponents argue that the values, political system, and historical development of the US are unique in human history, often with the implication that the country is both destined and entitled to play a distinct and positive role on the world stage. Now that may seem like a self-centered extreme view, but a lot of people align themselves along these lines, including Warren Buffett. In the 2020 annual meeting, Buffett went on an 18-minute rant on this specific topic. It's honestly a great watch, and I linked it in the description below. But for the sake of this video, I've concentrated the points to just focus on the most important aspects. The story starts slow, but I'll let Warren set the foundation, and I'll quickly finish off the main points after. Take a listen.
In 1929, my dad, who was 26 years of age then, was employed as a security salesman by a local small bank. And he sold stocks and bonds, but he mostly sold stocks. And when stocks fall 48%, and you were selling them to people a few months ago, you really don't feel like going out and facing those same people. So I think my dad probably elected to do, as they say now, shelter in place, which means stay at home. And
So the story starts with Warren's dad experiencing the start of the Great Depression. It's November 13th, 1929, and the Dow is down 48% off its highs. But there's one big problem with this event. At the time, nobody knew America was headed towards a depression. They just accepted this as any other recession, a small temporary dip in markets. Buffett is born 9 months later after the start of the story, and during this time, the Dow actually makes a recovery back to 240, going up about 20% off its lows. It's apparent to absolutely no one that the US is about to head towards the worst financial disaster in its history. Things are looking like they're bound for a strong recovery. You can hear Warren quickly explain this right here.
the stock market had actually recovered over 20% during that 9.5 month period or thereabouts. People did not think in the fall of 1930, they did not think they were in a Great Depression. They thought it was a recession very much like had occurred at least a dozen times, although not always when stock markets were important. But we'd had many recessions in the United States over the time, and this did not look like it was something dramatically out of the ordinary.
But what happens next is a perfect example of just how bad things can get. 10 days after his birth, the market goes up another 1 or 2%, and on September 10th, 1930, the Dow reaches 245, the highest point immediately following Warren's birth. But that turns out to be the last day before the nightmare. The Dow 2 years following this date falls to 41, an 83% drop. The worst decline in US history, and something none of us watching this channel have ever even come close to experiencing. Remember, this isn't a single stock, this is the Dow, essentially a representation of the American economy as a whole, and from peak to bottom, it had just dropped 89% in less than 2 years. This was the Great Depression. 4,000 bank failures and the complete destruction of the American working class were the result. And that's not the end of the story. Warren reminds us of the psychological impact this event had on America. We're talking about a period where people walked to their banks and found their entire life savings gone. The Dow took 25 years to recover. It wasn't until November 1954 that investors who held on got their break even. 1929 became a defining event in America's history that we today don't really appreciate. Here is Warren explaining the significance, and I'll wrap up with one final point.
So we had an enormous economic recovery, but the minds of people had been so scarred, the memories. Parents told their children. 1929 became a symbol in people's minds. I mean, if you said 1929, it was like saying 1776 or 1492. I mean, everybody knew exactly what you were talking about. And it affected stock prices in a rather remarkable way, to the point, if you'll change to the next slide, it was January 4th of 1951 that the kid who was born on August 30th in 1930 had finished college before the stock market got back to where it was at that earlier time. So
the point Warren is making is that for 25 years after 1929, this country experienced essentially no economic growth, and people didn't know how anything would turn out. In fact, by the time 1942 came around, the German army had taken over the vast majority of Europe and was 12 miles from Moscow. America's entire existence came under a legitimate threat. Yet, despite these massive stepbacks, the American miracle continued. The US would go on to win the war, and the Dow nearly 93 years later finds itself at 36,291. A person who invested $5,000 in the Dow on Warren's birthday would today have over $1 million. The point is, sure, there may be some tough times ahead, but America always finds a way, coming out on top in nearly every situation throughout history. Setback after setback, eventually the US crawled its way to the top from 1929. And while it may have taken almost 3 decades to do so, it did it despite massive uncertainties that make today's problems look like child's play. So sure, maybe tough times are ahead, but maybe that's what we need to build the fuel to reach new highs. I stand by Warren, and I'm a believer in American exceptionalism. And sure, America and the West have a lot to worry about, but just like in the past, we fight, we persist, and most importantly, we adapt. As always, thank you guys for watching. Make sure you hit that like and subscribe button if you enjoyed the video. And don't forget to check out masterworks.io. You can find the link in the description below.